We are on the air. Woo! This is Retrogame Talkshow with me, Bob Engstrand.
And me, Jari Karilainen.
We are recording this podcast in the winter wonderland known as Finland, Suomi. Jari is sitting way up in the northern part of the country, more specifically the city of Rovaniemi.
Or as we call it, Rölle.
Rölle. While I, Bob, I'm sitting down south in the capital Helsinki.
Hello there.
Hello. Jari, let's start with a small presentation of ourselves.
Oh, sure thing, Bob. For starters, I'm currently living pretty much halfway between my birthplace and your current home, as I was born in Nuorgam, which is the northernmost village in Finland. And I graduated as a musician with vocals as my main instrument from Kuopio Pop and Jazz Conservatory in, I think it was 2006. And I've been living in Rovaniemi since then. I've been freelancing in various cover bands since about 2001 or 2002, and my own songwriting endeavors have been released with bands called Jack Daniels Project and more recently Snow Report. And for the past 10 months, I think, I've been working for the city of Rovaniemi as an official city musician, which to my knowledge is a pretty rare position to have. Also, some retro gamers out there might have read the Finnish retro game comparison blog, which I've been the almost sole author for the past 4.5 years or so, and which I'm just about to bring to an end. And I guess that's about it, really. How about you, Bob?
I was born in a small countryside village in South Sweden called Gränum. I play the keyboards, piano for a living since 1999. That's the year I graduated from the Music Academy in Malmö city. I'm living and working in Finland since 2004, mostly doing live shows with various artists and bands. The last years I've been composing a few soundtracks for a few indie games. I've been also playing with a couple of bands that has toured in Finland and around the world, such as Dingo and the folk metal band Turisas. Now I play the keyboards in the Finnish progressive rock band called Von Hertzen Brothers, which is my current main band. So Jari, let's talk just a little bit about how we came up with the idea of making this podcast.
From what I remember, we have actually talked about doing some sort of a radio show or a podcast for many years now. I can't even remember when the first such idea popped into our heads, but yeah, it's been sort of brewing slowly somewhere. And somehow now that I'm on the verge of quitting the blog, I think that sort of made things moving forwards with the podcast. And suddenly I had the idea of contacting you about this podcast, and let's just get it over with and start doing it.
I know that some people have told me for the last 10 years, once in a while, like, hey, why don't you have a radio show? And I've never really understood, is that a compliment? You know, like, what is that? Why should I have a radio show? You know?
Yeah.
But I guess that also I remember Manna, my wife, told us some years ago that you guys should have some kind of talk show or radio channel or whatever where you talk about stuff. And it's never really been any details of what the show should be about.
Yeah.
But this sort of makes sense to me, that sort of talking about retro gaming, everything from 8-bit to 16-bit to old school PC, that is sort of what we are into, and that's sort of what we have based our friendship on for the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, definitely. It's just natural that this podcast thing should be concentrated on that subject.
Yeah,
I guess.
We are not sure exactly what it will contain in the future, but it will definitely have a lot of based on Commodore 64, gaming, music, Spectrum, Amiga, Atari, old PC stuff.
MSX, Sword M5, Amstrad, Nintendo, whatever.
Early, mid, late 80s. And we will definitely dig into some of those important years in retro gaming.
Yeah. The important years that you mentioned, I think the most important part of the whole old classic sort of 8-bit gaming period must have been around 84 to 88, I think.
Yeah, that sounds very much like sort of the peak of... If we specifically say the Commodore 64, the peak years, 84 to 88.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a Retrogame Talkshow, everybody, and welcome. Let's go back in time. Jari, what was the first electronic game or electronic games that you remember playing?
Electronic meaning, you mean those handhelds or...
Yeah, sure. Let's go with the handheld, the Game & Watch, or if you had a lot of those.
I didn't have much of Game & Watch games myself, but I do remember having seen plenty of them back in the day. The only one that we had in my family was called Donkey Kong Jr.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of single screen thing from Game & Watch. I think it's from 1982. Yeah, the basic gist of the game was just to play as little Donkey Kong Jr. and save your dad from the... little jail at the top of the screen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the only one we had. And, well, the other games that I think I might have seen at the time, sometime during the early 80s, of course, the other Donkey Kong games were very popular. And I remember seeing those in various homes, the Donkey Kong 1 and 2 both.
Yeah.
And one of my friends even had a tabletop version of Donkey Kong Jr., which was a completely different game, and that was cool.
Yeah.
What else? There were those Mario games on Game & Watch, and there was also one tabletop. I think it was Mario Cement Factory.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
Oh yeah, that was a great little Game & Watch tabletop. I do remember one that wasn't probably a Nintendo game at all. It was this electronic toy kind of thing with a racing wheel on it. I'm not sure if the maker of that was Tomy or whatever, but I do distinctly remember this little weird electronic toy with a steering wheel and a screen that had a road in it and a specific set of cars on both sides of the road, and you would just steer around those cars, and that was the game.
Oh yeah. Cool.
Really basic stuff, but so much fun when I was a 2-year-old kid, you know.
Yeah.
And, well, I think there were some later handheld versions of some Konami games, like Blades of Steel, and the other one was some Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, but I have never seen them in action, actually. I've only seen the games, you know, the handhelds themselves. I have no idea how they are to play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds so cool. We should also let the listeners know that like what year we are both born.
I was born in 1981, so
yeah, you are 5 years younger than me. I'm born in 76.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's a certain age difference that allows Bob to have more experience with, I guess, Game & Watch games too. What was your experience with Game & Watches and other?
Yeah, I remember we had some kind of clone of this Nintendo Game & Watch. We had some clone, VTech Time and Fun, it was called.
I have never heard of it.
Yeah, they didn't do as many games as the Nintendo Game & Watch did, but Pancake was the very first game we had, Pancake and Monkey. And it was like a single screen, and they were made in 1981, so I must have been at least 5 years old, probably maybe 6. Maybe we had them in 82 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that was the very first game. It had the game A, game B, and the time, and 2 buttons. So there was no fire. There was only moving left or right, and you were this waiter who tried to sort of catch the pancakes that the chef was throwing up in the air. And I remember that the amount of time that me and my sister, we played those games, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Monkey from VTech as well. You were this man sitting in coconut trees and trying to bash down monkeys who climb the trees, which sounds today very cruel, to hit a monkey in the head with a bat.
Yeah.
Games were more violent back then. And then I remember we had a lot of those original Nintendo Game & Watch, like you mentioned, Donkey Kong Jr.
Yeah.
I had the original Donkey Kong, the orange double screen thing.
Yeah, and those are great ones.
And Donkey Kong 2, which was sort of dark brown color, also a dual screen.
Yeah, classic stuff.
You mentioned the tabletop Mario Cement Factory. You played the tabletop version of. Yeah, because I had the sort of basic handheld version of the Cement Factory.
Yeah.
And then I remember we had Donkey Kong 3, and this was something called Micro versus System. Also Game & Watch, 1984.
Yeah, it was one of those with 2 controllers, right?
Yeah, it was like this 2 controllers that was connected to the actual screen.
Yeah.
So Donkey Kong 3 was like you competed against the computer or a friend.
Yeah.
There was sort of these insects and you had to sort of spray them to the other side, to the opponent's side of the screen. That I remember I played a lot. So this was sort of in the very beginning of the 80s, like between 81 and 84, sort of. But of course, my computer gaming, they sort of merged into this, because I remember playing Game & Watch in sort of 86. By that time I already had a Commodore 64 and a Sword M5 and stuff like that. So, but this was definitely the sort of the first experience of playing an electronic game.
Yeah. You had plenty of Game & Watch and other electronic game experience.
It was a big thing back then.
Yeah, I hadn't even heard of half of those games that you mentioned, but that's cool.
Yeah, it was so easy because they were mobile. You had these, I think it was 1 or 2 of these pretty thick batteries, small but thick batteries. And I remember that you can have them in your pockets, and in a way that's, if you think about today, it's pretty much the same thing. So it was super modern in that way that you can have a really cool game with you.
Yeah,
like a handheld electronic game.
Yeah, of course they were sort of replaced by the Nintendo Game Boy in the very early 90s, and now we have mobile phones to play with.
Yeah, I guess that since our age difference, did you have any of those Nintendo Game Boy?
Well, I didn't have them at the time. I do have now some Game Boy games in my collection, but one of my friends did have a Game Boy. He used to bring it to school and play Bomberman and Alleyway and Super Mario Land and whatnot.
Yeah.
During the breaks, of course. And
do you remember what year those Game Boy were released?
Oh, I think it might have been at around 89 or 90.
Because that's sort of if it was around 89, 90, that was sort of when I was probably still playing Commodore 64 a lot, and I think I also had my Atari ST, so I didn't really play any handheld stuff in 89, 90.
So moving on from Game & Watch games and all those other handhelds, and what was your first sort of gaming experience on big screen television?
The first thing I can remember playing something on a TV that is connected to a TV was, I had a friend in school when I was really young.
Yeah.
He had an Intellivision.
Oh, that's cool.
That they look really cool with these game controls. They looked like telephone number, like number sets.
Yep.
And it had this sort of wooden looking console, like brown.
Yeah.
I think the Intellivision might have come out in, I don't know, 81. I remember that I was super impressed by my friend who had this Intellivision, and we played this advanced Dungeons and Dragons Cloudy Mountain.
Yeah.
And we also played Masters of the Universe, this He-Man, the Power of He-Man.
Oh, yeah.
And those were, I think, both games from like 82.
Must have been.
And I remember being so impressed of seeing something that looked so cool on a TV that we are actually playing this game. I remember that the next day in school, I remember that I was sitting with a pen and paper and I tried to draw the game. And I was so inspired by that Dungeons and Dragons, like we were running there and shooting arrows at snakes, you know.
Yeah.
That was a really cool thing. So I must have been around 6 or 7 years old then.
Yeah. That brings much memories to me as well, because I had a tendency to draw those game screens as well from games that I had seen or played around maybe 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah.
So I had plenty of drawings of ZX Spectrum games like Dynamite Dan or Wanted Monty Mole or whatever.
Another friend had a Philips G7000, if you know what that is.
Yeah, that's a kind of a rare console. I think it was called Odyssey 2 in the United States, and it was originally manufactured by Magnavox.
Yeah, that's true. Magnavox Odyssey 2. That's true, yeah.
Yeah.
And he had a few games, but I can't really remember those sort of games. But that's pretty much my experience, my first experience of playing something that is hooked up to a TV.
Yeah.
What do you remember from that sort of platform?
The only thing I can remember before I had a ZX Spectrum was, I think my uncle had it took me a long time to actually, come up with what he had, because the memories of this were so vague for a long time. But I did find out that he had an Atari 2600.
Oh, yeah.
And the game that I used to play on it quite a lot was Pac-Man, of all games.
Classic stuff.
Yeah. And, the reason why I didn't, have that good memories of the game, because the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man is not a very good conversion of the arcade game.
All right.
I mean, it's so blocky. The ghosts going around the screen are flashing all the time. It has lots of, collision detection problems and everything. So it's basically really crappy version of Pac-Man, but it has so much nostalgia to me that I really actually prefer it over the arcade original for whatever reason. So, but that's nostalgia for you.
It is. Sometimes it's difficult to make a distinction between what is nostalgia and what is really good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's sort of the whole point of these memories from the childhood, like,
Definitely.
What would you think about it today? Well, it doesn't really matter, because I experienced it when I was a child,
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now that we have gone through our first experiences with handhelds and other gaming machines for TVs and whatnot, then we move on to our own very first computers. So, what was yours?
The very first computer we had home in my family, I remember we had a very rare Japanese computer called Sword M5.
How did that come about?
I don't remember. I think my father bought that from somebody. He didn't buy it from the store. Somebody was selling it, and he thought it would be a good introduction to, like an educating thing to have a home computer home. And that was released in late 82. So I think this must have been in 83.
Okay.
And it was a small computer that you connected to a TV.
Yeah.
And you could load some small games, either cartridge. There was a lot of games released on cartridge, and operating system was on cartridge.
Okay.
And you can also load on tape.
Yeah.
Load from tape. Yeah, the Sword M5, kind of a rare thing. I have read that the computer sold very well in Czechoslovakia, the former Czech Republic.
And apparently it was kind of known in Sweden as well, but how on earth did it come to Sweden all of a sudden?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It's a very rare computer, and there's not so much information out there about the Sword M5. So it's a really cool little thing.
Yeah.
And it had some similar games that the Commodore 64 had, for example, Fruit Search, Tank Battalion. I remember playing a game called Snakey, and it was this that you could find in cell phones, sort of in the late 90s. These where you have a snake and you eat insects, and then you grow, and then you're trying to avoid the walls and avoid yourself.
Yeah.
So I remember that was maybe the first game that I played on our first home computer in my home.
Okay.
Snakey. And I remember games like some baseball game, Dragon Attack. Pooyan was one game that was a pretty famous game on other platforms as well.
Yeah, it's an arcade classic. I think it's from 1981.
Yes, that makes sense, yeah. So yeah, that was Sword M5. That's something that you guys listening to this should Google, because that's a rare little gem.
Yeah. I have tried to find ways to play these Sword M5 games, but the only emulator that can run Sword M5 is MES, which is a multi-platform emulator system. It's really a tough piece to get working, and but it's definitely worth checking out. I mean, this is a really interesting piece of hardware. I mean, this is almost like an MSX-based computer, but it's pre-MSX, so it's a very interesting phase in that sort of computer technology.
Yeah, and it's not so rare, so it won't have its own Wikipedia page. You can actually find some information about the Sword M5. There's a few YouTube videos out there where people are playing some of these games that I name dropped earlier that I had as well. I had some of the games on cartridge and some of the games I had on cassette. Yeah, that was a strong memory when my father came home with that computer, and I was like, wow, I've heard about these things called computers.
Yeah.
You know.
So did you do any actual programming on this first computer of yours?
I remember that there was some magazine or some sort of article or something that maybe came along to the computer. There was a big sort of manual that came along to the computer, and I remember sitting down for hours and hours and actually programming it by a sort of ready list of software that was sort of listed how to program it.
Okay.
So I remember actually sitting in and doing that for hours and hours, thinking that I would create this amazing game, and then it was just some sort of very, very simple Pong kind of game, you know.
Yeah, but Pong is great. I mean,
yeah, of course. But you know, you sit and type in these things for like 6 hours.
Yeah.
And then you're expecting sort of a Defender of the Crown, you know. But all you get is some sprite going one way, and this is it, you know.
Yeah.
But so I actually did. I don't know if that's called really programming, because it wasn't really, you know. But it was sort of I typed off a sheet. You know? But that was really cool.
Yeah, my first computer was a ZX Spectrum, the rubber keyed 48K version of it, and well, we did some actual programming on it because it's much easier to program like graphics and basic beepy sounds on a Spectrum than it is on a C64. I never got into programming that much on a C64 because there was so much more games available for the C64, so I didn't have to try to create anything of my own.
That's a good point. We didn't have time to program because we were so busy playing all these amazing games.
Yeah. But yeah, I did some programming on the ZX Spectrum for a while, you know, drawing basic pictures and doing some beepy music and that sort of stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much that I have ever done by myself, and most of the other stuff has been just typing in some listings made in magazines, you know.
What games do you remember from the ZX Spectrum?
Oh, so much games. Because this was still a time when the C64 wasn't as big. Because the releases of the ZX Spectrum 48 and the C64, they were released in Europe like 6 months apart, I think. So there was much more games available for the ZX Spectrum, and it was already big in Finland at that time. And you know, the library that you got straight away with the computer, bundled with the Spectrum, it had a few games from Ultimate Play the Game, like Jetpack, Cookie, Psst was one of them, and I do remember a racing game called Checkered Flag, which was a first-person racing game. And
Checkered Flag? Sorry for interrupting, but I remember playing that on arcade in the late 80s.
Yeah, but that's not it. It's a Spectrum exclusive. It's not the same game.
It's not the same game. Okay, no, same name. All right.
Yeah. And this was time trials. You just drive this Formula One car, first person, and you just switch gears and drive around a track, and it's just time trial. But at that time, 83 on a home computer, it was magical.
Yeah.
And there was nothing much like it until the game was called Revs, which was made originally for the Acorn BBC Micro by Geoff Crammond, who later did the Stunt Car Racer and Formula One Grand Prix series.
Okay.
But anyway,
pretty big games.
Yeah, Checkered Flag was the first one that I remember having been that way. And of course, you get Manic Miner, which was a Spectrum original, and I used to play Pole Position, which was a very sorry piece of software for the Spectrum. I never got around liking that, but I do remember it was one of the first games that I tried.
Oh yeah.
And it always had some sort of loading problems. I only got it working like 2 or 3 times ever. You know, it's just a horrible mess compared to all the other versions of Pole Position.
Yeah. Do you remember how old you were when you got the actual ZX Spectrum home?
I'm not actually sure, but I think it must have been 84 or 85. So I would have been 3 or 4 years old at the time.
That sounds so extremely young to use a computer, but when you think about today's kids, it's a pretty normal age, I guess.
Yeah. And, I think I was around 5 when I started learning English because of these games. I mean, I had a couple of text adventures that I wanted to try to play, like Planet of Death was one of the text adventures I had on Spectrum, and I think we had also The Hobbit.
Oh, yeah. The text adventure Hobbit, right?
Yeah. For some reason, I never really played it that much. Probably because I didn't understand English, but,
Yeah.
You can always try.
Yeah, that's actually a huge thing, what you just mentioned, this learning English, which is none of our native languages.
Yeah.
Yours is Finnish, mine is Swedish.
Yeah.
It was such a huge thing to learn and to sort of force yourself to understand what these games were about, because as you mentioned, some of these games were text-based.
Entirely text-based.
And I remember asking my parents, like, what is this word examine? What does that mean, examine? And then I learned that word, and I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I know the word examine in English.
Yeah.
And playing these early C64 text adventures forced us to learn English. There was a huge will in us to wanting to understand these games.
Yeah.
So that was a very powerful force to learn a foreign language by these computer games.
Yeah, great learning tool. And also, I mean, you can't really program unless you understand some basic English words like print or if, for, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, load, run.
Yeah, exactly.
Space, bar.
Yeah.
And I remember that coming to school and when the first English lesson started. I think in Sweden we start back in the 80s. We start when we are 10 years old to study English in school. And I remember that I and this other guy who had the television, we were a bit ahead thanks to our gaming experience, you know. Like we knew some words that the teacher didn't know.
Examine.
You know? Yeah, examine. Hey, it's been really fun reminiscing our first small steps as gamers. We started out with our first electronic handhelds, first played games on a TV screen, to our first own computers. I think these were pretty good ingredients for our first episode. What do you think?
Oh, yes, definitely, as it was planned or something. I mean, it's such a specific kind of time travel moment to get to what's basically the earliest childhood memories you might have, or at least that's how it is for me. But yeah, I'd say it's an epic start for a retro game talk show.
Absolutely. But hey, it's time to end. Thanks for an awesome first episode to my colleague in the north.
And the same goes to my awesome colleague in the south. And thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed our blast from the past. You can find links to our other social media pages in the description to this episode. So please send us some comments and, all sorts of feedback I welcome.
Yes, please do. You also can send us email at retrogametalkshow@gmail.com. Any suggestions for future episodes are also more than welcome.
Exactly.
But we do have a subject ready for the next episode already, and that's gonna be
the arcades.
Arcade memories, arcade history, arcade home conversions.
Yeah, practically all things arcade that we can think of.
All things arcade. But until then, I'm Bob.
And I'm Jari.
And this is Retrogame Talkshow.